We're traveling north on the Natchez Trace Parkway. The parkway started out as just old Indian trails. In the early 1800s, the government turned it into a military road, starting in Natchez, Mississippi, going through Indian Territory, up to Nashville, Tennessee. We're heading to the location on the old trace where the famous explorer Captain Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition either was murdered or committed suicide. It's also the location of his grave. Now it's located at mile marker 385.9. This is President Thomas Jefferson. Around 1801, Jefferson asked Meriwether Lewis to come to Washington to be his private secretary. Now, the families were acquainted because they were both from the same county in Virginia. This is Captain Lewis. In 1803, President Jefferson appointed Captain Lewis to command an expedition to explore the newly acquired lands of the Louisiana Purchase. As an assistant, Lewis recommended his friend, Captain William Clark. During the 2.5 years expedition exploring the great Northwest, Lewis and several of the men in the party became severely ill. It could have been from diseases caught from native Indians. Captain Lewis dispersed mercury pills, which was the treatment in those days. Of course, nowadays we know that mercury causes mental deterioration over a period of time. When Lewis and Clark returned from their expedition of the West, President Jefferson, as a reward, appointed Meriwether Lewis to be the governor of the Upper Northwest Territory, with the governor's office located in St. Louis. However, before leaving for St. Louis to take his position, Governor Lewis became sick. He would have mood swings and sometimes not think rationally, with a fever. After recuperating for almost a year at the home and under the care of his mother, Lucille, he felt well enough to travel on to St. Louis. While governor, his mental condition seemed to worsen. He'd sometimes think straight and do an excellent job, and other times he could not get anything done, and he couldn't get along with others. He could not complete jobs. He submitted bills to Washington that they started refusing to pay, especially after the new administration of President Madison took power. He had bouts with severe depression and began drinking a lot. Governor Lewis decided to go to Washington to answer the charges that were against him. He left instructions on what to do while he was gone. With a small escort party of men, they headed down the Mississippi River. When the party reached the New Madrick, Governor Lewis wrote his last will and testament, leaving everything to his mother. The group intended to go to New Orleans and then by ship around Florida and up the East Coast to Washington. However, for some reason, the governor changed his mind and decided to go overland. Now, this is Fort Pickering, or what is now Memphis, Tennessee. When the Lewis party reached Fort Pickering, the men told the fort commander, a Captain Russell, who was a friend actually of Governor Lewis, that the governor had tried to commit suicide on his way down the river and had to be restrained. Captain Russell forced the governor to remain at Fort Pickering under his personal care for 2 weeks until Lewis regained control of his mental state. Captain Russell assigned the newly appointed Chickasaw Indian agent, James Neely, to escort the governor and his servant through Indian Territory. The party followed an Indian trail through the wilderness to the Chickasaw Agency, located on the Natchez Trace south of what is now Tupelo, Mississippi. When they reached the agency, they were delayed another 3 days because of the governor's illness. He finally got well enough to travel. They started up the trace. Now the blue line that you see is the Tennessee River. They had to cross the river by ferry. The government had made a deal with Chickasaw chiefs in order to let people cross Chickasaw lands. The chiefs would build stands or houses for travelers to stop and rest, thus charging them money. Now at the river, Chief George Colbert had a stand and a ferry. He had been known to overcharge when ferry travelers crossed the river, but I seriously doubt that he would have overcharged Major Neely, the new Indian agent. It's been said that he did overcharge General Jackson when he was taking his army down the trace to the Battle of New Orleans in 1812. I can't hardly see how anyone overcharged a general with a battle-ready army, but who knows? Now this is a picture of Chief Colbert's stand. This picture shows a run-down house, so it might have been taken years later. Colbert's home has been described by travelers as a jewel in the forest. A few hundred yards north of Colbert's stand is the Tennessee River. Now the gully on the left is the old trace going down to where Colbert's ferry was. The Tennessee River, keep in mind, at that time was only a third as wide as it is today, but it was a lot swifter and deeper. The Lewis party crossed the river and traveled about 40 miles north before pitching camp for the night. And during the night, a heavy rainstorm came through, and 2 of the pack mules broke loose. Major Neely knew that Governor Lewis was in a bad way, so he told the governor to go ahead and wait for him when he came to Grinder's stand, while Major Neely would go look for the 2 mules that were lost. Now this is looking south on the old trace. If you had been standing here on the 10th of October, 1809, around sunset, you would have seen Governor Lewis riding up the trace with 2 servants walking a long distance behind. Grinder's stand was run by a man named Grinder and his wife Priscilla. Now this is a cabin built by the Park Service close to the original Grinder's stand. Mr. Grinder was not at home when the governor arrived. Only Priscilla and her children were there. Now Priscilla told Lewis that her husband had gone hunting, but most likely he was attending a whiskey still that he used to sell illegal whiskey to Indians. Mrs. Grinder said that when Lewis arrived, he took his saddle off his horse and asked her if she was alone. She said the governor seemed a little strange, making her uneasy. She asked if he was alone, and he said no, he had servants that were following behind, making her feel a little better. He went ahead and paid for himself and the servants for the night's stay. She said that she began cooking supper for them all. During supper, Governor Lewis would talk real kind and state what a wonderful meal it was, and then all of a sudden jump up and start talking to himself and walking back and forth. He'd walk up to her and then turn around and go the other way. Then he would come back and sit down, light his pipe, and say what a wonderful night it was. She was greatly relieved when the servants arrived. They told her not to worry. He wouldn't hurt her, only himself. She fixed a bed for the governor, and the 2 servants went to the barn and slept in the loft. Priscilla, still scared, took her kids to stay in the kitchen, which was off from the house a few paces, and locked herself in. She said she could still hear him pacing back and forth on the floor and walking and talking to himself. Around 3 in the morning, she heard a gunshot and a plump on the floor, and then another gunshot. She was afraid to go see about him, and in a little while she heard him outside her door asking for help and water, and would she bind his wounds. She was afraid to open the door and could hear him rattling the water buckets. She said she could hear him moaning as he crawled back to his room. The next morning she sent her kids to fetch the servants from the barn. The barn was several yards from the house in this location, and it's believed that they could not have heard the gunshots. When they reached his room, he was laying across the bed, still alive and blood-soaked. He had one wound to his chest and one to his head. The servant said he asked them to take his gun and blow his head off. He would give them all the money he had if they would do it. And of course they refused. A few hours later, Governor Meriwether Lewis, the famous explorer, was dead. He's buried a few hundred yards from Grinder's stand. When Major Neely arrived, he was told what happened, and he quickly informed by letter ex-President Jefferson. Now this is a copy of that letter. Neely's explaining what he's doing with Lewis's belongings, and also sending Lewis's free servant, John Pernay, to inform Lewis's mother of the tragedy. Now 7 months after the death of Governor Lewis, a close friend of the governor's, Alexander Wilson, left Natchez on his way to Grinder's stand to question Ms. Grinder about the death of his friend. Stopping by Lewis's grave and then continuing down the trace to the stand. Now this is a letter that Alexander Wilson wrote a friend after questioning Priscilla Grinder. He said that she was gracious and gave a full account of the incident. To complicate matters, 2 unidentified graves were later found on the Grinder property, giving rise to the speculation that Mr. Grinder might have killed them and possibly killed Lewis. He was even charged, but was let go for lack of evidence. This controversy still goes on until this day. Now, it is my opinion that Governor Lewis committed suicide, knowing that his disease, whatever it was, malarial, venereal, or mercury poison, would only get worse. I believe his friends like President Jefferson, William Clark, and others, and even his servants, tried hard to protect his reputation and honor, as they should. I believe not wanting to put his family and friends through what he knew was in his future. He knew he was quickly losing control of his faculties and made his decision while he still could. It cannot be said that Meriwether Lewis did not have courage. Governor Lewis was 35 years old.